Hello, and welcome to the third installment of Ask a Scientist, brought to you by myself, Dr. Andrew Robak, and the Penn Library. Again, an appeal to you. Please ask questions. This is a viewer question one, and I think it's a pretty good one. Better than what I would have came up with to talk about myself. So drop a comment, send an email to me or the Penn Library, and I'll get it. And then I'll have cool things to talk about and answer. So this question was brought to us by Kyle, and he asked, with a little bit of preface, scientists have discovered microplastics in human organs, and this came out fairly recently. And the question is, how much can we take before we start seeing ill effects? So how much microplastics can we be exposed to within ourselves before we have to start worrying about it? And this is a great question. Though there's a lot of facets to it. So let's take a little bit of time and figure out what it all means. So what is a microplastic? In this case, it's all in the name. Micro generally means small. Plastic, we know what those are. I've talked a little bit about it in video 1 if you want to go back and watch that. But a microplastic is really just a small piece of plastic. So if we break out our good friend, the ruler, by definition, the biggest microplastic is 5 millimeters or less. So this little corner of the ruler here, pretty small, but actually not so small, right? You can see this. So 5 millimeters is the biggest, but it can get down to like micrometers. So the smallest detected piece of microplastic was 1.6 micrometers. So this line in between 0 and 1 millimeters there is quite small. Divide that into 1,000 pieces, you've got a micrometer, and that's really, really tiny. But where do they come from? In this case, there's a lot of different possible sources. So primary sources of, and by primary we don't mean like the main source, but like the simplest source is just small pieces of plastic. So as before mentioned, the pieces of artificial turf, the little black bits, those are very small. They're designed to be small. If that gets into the environment, those are microplastics. Another one that made news not so long ago was little exfoliating plastic beads in cosmetics. Those are microplastics. The problem with them is they don't tend to go away, right? They rinse down the drain, they end up in the water system. Do they get captured by the water treatment plant, or do they just end up in our lakes and in our water systems where something might end up ingesting it? Another source which tends to get talked about more for things like our ocean or our secondary sources is anything that's sort of broken or worn off, right? So we tend to think of our plastic waste as, this is pretty solid stuff. It's not going to biodegrade very easily. It's going to kind of stay in this form in the landfill forever. It turns out that's not quite the case. So bits of plastic get into the ocean, and just that mechanical like force of waves and water and other bits sort of pounding onto pieces of plastic, eventually they kind of wear down and little pieces will fragment off, and those become microplastics. So our ocean is actually quite polluted with microplastics. But even besides the ocean, major sources of microplastics are things like clothing. So if you have clothes that have synthetic fibers and you've ever washed them and ran them through the dryer, like where does all that lint come from? That dryer lint is microplastics if you're using synthetic fibers for your clothes. If that gets in the air, blows out the end of the dryer, right? We're putting this stuff out there whether we think about it or not. Another thing is tires on your car. They don't last forever, right? They wear down, they get smaller and smaller until the tread's gone. You got to replace them. Of course, we throw away the tire, it gets disposed of, but where'd all that plastic go from driving? Those are microplastics that's out there in the environment. It's hard to prevent, right? So we have things like litter, which can eventually sort of break down and put these into an environment. And we think about water systems, that's a major problem, which is true. But we're also generating these things just with casual uses of plastic. They're everywhere. All right, so the question at hand. So what are microplastics? We kind of got covered these tiny bits of plastic. Where do they come from? There's lots of different sources of them. What's it going to take for them to harm people? What are the harmful effects, and how much does it take to cause us these sort of problems? The real answer for this, for me and for science in general, is we don't know. It's pretty new. The term microplastic is only a few years old. We've been studying these for only a short period of time. We don't really know what's going to happen to most of our environment and our people. All the studies that come out are very new, and we're not really sure. So we can still make some sense out of this, though. Rather than sort of panicky, we're all doomed. It's not quite at that level. Some important things to think about in terms of environmental exposures for people and then for effects just out in the world are the dose makes the poison. So, this is an old chemical term which really rings true today. The tiniest amount of something out there into the ocean, into the world, it's probably not going to make much of a difference, right? We don't want to pollute things, but if we're trying to realistically assess harm, if there's only a little bit of something, it's probably not so harmful. So the less is better in this case. The less we continue to put out, the less we are exposed to is always going to be better, even if we don't know what the harm could be. The other piece that's helpful is this plastic doesn't biodegrade. It's pretty strong. It doesn't come apart very easily. That's sort of its benefit, right? That's why we use it. Plastic's great for storing water, foods, acids, acidic stuff, chemicals, right? It doesn't break down. It's really good at that. It doesn't do a lot of chemistry, so being exposed to a little bit of plastic ingested or however is going to be a lot less risky than chemical that's going to do some sort of interaction, say dissolve in the bloodstream. It's like pharmaceuticals have side effects because they're meant to come into the body and do some chemistry. Plastics don't do a lot of chemistry once they're formed. It's very uncommon. So in general, they're pretty safe things. So if we have small amounts of these fairly safe pieces, that's good. They're not going to do a lot of chemistry. It's not necessarily the chemistry that we're worried about, though. It is just more like a physical clogging sort of effect. So plastics, if we have these little tiny pieces in aquatic systems, they could build up in fish, right? So they're skimming the water, eating microorganisms, eating smaller things. A lot of chemicals and pollutants tend to accumulate in fish if they can't be passed through. So a risk to our aquatic life is all these little tiny pieces of plastic, starting to slowly accumulate and build up in fish as we're putting more and more and more out into the environment. If we never stop, they're just going to keep getting more and more microplastics. Again, so we haven't really seen these harmful effects yet. We're just starting to look for them. It doesn't mean that they're not there. It doesn't mean that they are. It's just, we're not quite there yet in terms of the science. So what we tend to see that makes the news are articles that are very new. So scientists did study about 43 human organs from deceased people and found microplastics in them. But since that's so new, what we need to do before we start to really take that as scientific fact is say, all right, well, can other people do the same thing? Do they find the same results, right? Was there anything wrong with their methods, or was it right? Right, so we repeat that over and over and over again to say, oh, okay, wow, yeah, humans' organs really do have microplastics in them. We haven't done that yet. From there, we can start to look at, are there any harmful effects, right? Has exposure to this, someone who's exposed to more versus less, did they have worse health outcomes? I don't think we've done that yet. We're just not quite there. People haven't done all the studies yet. So in the sciences, what you really need is someone to do the pioneering work, like we're starting to, and say, oh, crap, let's start worrying about this. And then a lot of follow-up work saying, how are we going to study this? What's the best way? How are we going to get good data, and just keep going at it? And then we can start to get a real consensus and start to say, hey, here we've got all this information, which is saying this is something we should be concerned about, or maybe this is something we shouldn't be concerned about. Um, Again, this is separating the human health impacts from sort of the concerns with sort of littering and causing environmental problems from just waste out there in the grass and in the oceans and in the lakes, which we clearly don't want. But in terms of, is this going to hurt people? We don't really know yet. It's not really time to worry. A lot of people will jump to conclusions real early and say, this toxic plastic is everywhere, it's poisoning us, that's why we're so unhealthy and things like that. And it's just guesswork, which isn't scientific and not particularly helpful. The idea is good and say, hey, microplastics, they're there, right? What are they getting into? What harm could they cause? How are we going to study to figure out if they really are? That's what we should be doing, and that's what good science is doing now. Just in terms of what do we know, it's very small at this point. So that could make you worry more because we don't know if they're harmful or not. It could make you worry less because we don't know that they are harmful. Again, less exposure is always going to be better than more. We should be cautious, and we should figure out how to stop getting them all into the environment. How to slow down the formation of these microplastics, to get less out there, so then we don't have to worry about it quite so much. But yeah, lots more to say, but I don't want to make it too long. Please feel free to ask more questions in the comments on Facebook with the library, directly on YouTube, whatever works easier for you. And please ask questions and challenge my assumptions. Another good bit of science is don't accept expert opinions at total face value without thinking about it at all. And again, that's why I wanted to talk about the scientific process for these sort of things a little bit. But yeah, microplastics, we don't really know.